The Sega Dreamcast was the best. Coming out on the fated day 9/9/99 in America anyways. I was 9 when this thing came out, and still to this day I look at this silly console like it's new, shiny, and the future of gaming, and not at all like 22 years old now. Despite at one point being the fastest selling video game console ever, seriously, look it up, Sega's little baby got absolutely destroyed by a litany of weird decisions, a lack of mass appeal exclusives, and a little console called the PlayStation 2 being announced prior to its release. Whoops. Even though the Dreamcast would last barely 3 years, being formally discontinued in March of 2001, this thing had a ridiculous amount of video games come out on it. Tons of bangers we all know, like Soul Calibur, Phantasy Star Online, Sonic Adventure, Skies of Arcadia, Grandia 2, and Power Stone. Most of these have been ported elsewhere at this point, and that makes sense considering they rule. There's in total over 600 different games to play, even if a lot of them were made by smaller Japanese indie developers years after it was pronounced dead. That of course leaves us with many games that have been left forgotten in time. I'm gonna be keeping it to games from the 90s and early 2000s though. And as much as I'd like to get into Sega Gaga, I'd need to understand Japanese in order to fully understand it because there's no English patch yet. One day. I just hope that as a society we haven't yet forgotten Choo Choo Rocket. Choo Choo Rocket, So yo, it's Austin, and today I'm gonna be diving into the weird world of forgotten Dreamcast games. Now, I'm sure there's some youngin' out there who's like, you mean all of them? But for us olds who actually played this baby, there's a lot of really quality stuff out there. You ever played Dynamite Cop? Well, you should. It was also the first video game console with internet access, which means you didn't have to have a gaming PC to play games online like Alien Front Online, Quake 3 Arena, or Phantasy Star Online. This was about as high-tech as I could get back in the day, what with SegaNet and Browser 2.0 being clearly the most insecure ways of getting online. Yeah, maybe you're not gonna be surfing the internet on a Dreamcast in 2022, but you do at home. And speaking of, this video's been sponsored by Surfshark. Y'all know what Surfshark is. It's a VPN, a virtual private network that allows you to encrypt and mask your internet connection to buff up your security when you're online. With Surfshark, you'll be able to connect to the internet from virtually anywhere in the world. Region-blocked content defeated in the blink of an eye. I actually use Surfshark for several reasons these days, mostly for security. The biggest reason being protecting myself when connecting to public Wi-Fis while traveling. Use a VPN first, and don't get yourself keylogged at an airport Wi-Fi like someone I know. I also use Surfshark to watch a lot of region-locked content on Netflix or Fight.tv. With a click of a button, I'm able to watch Lord of the Rings or yell out Adam Cole, baby. Honestly, Surfshark's become a regular part of my routine, and it should become part of yours as well. It's extremely easy to use, and it'll help you get past those pesky geo-blocks and really free up the internet. So go and get yourself Surfshark VPN by clicking the link down in the description and using the code AustinEruption. That's gonna save you 83% and get you 3 months for free. That's code AustinEruption, one word. Thanks so much to Surfshark VPN for sponsoring today's video, but for now, it's time for my nuanced and intellectual take on the Dreamcast. Dreamcast good? Am I totally biased? Sure, yeah, but what were you obsessed with at the age of 10? For me, it was Phantasy Star Online. Not really a forgotten game by my standards, but also it's one that I still go back to and sink countless hours into, like literally yesterday. The things I think are gonna be the most interesting to highlight are gonna be the Dreamcast exclusives that time's totally left behind. No ports, no modern re-releases, and nothing like Seaman, which while obscure is definitely remembered on virtue of how bizarre it is. I'm thinking more along the lines of Toy Commander. When I first got my Dreamcast on that fated Christmas day, Toy Commander was the second game I opened after Sonic Adventure, and I played the heck out of this by myself. What, you think us Sega kids had friends? So Toy Commander was a game made by No Cliche, who didn't do too much besides this. In this game, you are quite literally the title of the game. This creepy, winking child playing with toys. You take control of one of several tiny vehicles and do missions like blow up the thing, blow up several of the things, or the much more nuanced cook the egg. There's a lot of different missions, parts of the house, vehicles, and weapons to use. This came out in the middle of like the Twisted Metal vehicle combat era of games, as well as the same year as Toy Story 2, so for me, this was like a perfect recipe. Unfortunately, no Rob Zombie in the soundtrack though. This and the UK exclusive Toy Racer were cool little games that time's totally forgotten.
and the developer too, as they shut down very shortly after these came out. But what about something Sega made? Sega was and still is kind of a powerhouse as a developer, and during the Saturn and Dreamcast era, they were firing on all cylinders. A constant slew of new IPs, sequels, franchises, licensed games, and the random oddity here and there. They had multiple divisions working on stuff at the same time, and if you ever take a moment to browse the whole catalog, you're bound to find weird stuff you didn't know about. For example, one of the first video games based on Magic the Gathering was a Japanese-only Dreamcast game. How did we not get this? And as much as I'd love to talk about one of the multiple Love Hina Sega-developed games, one that I definitely wish I had when I was 14, we gotta mention Outrigger. The Dreamcast's online functionality really put it ahead of the game. I mean, heck, even the PlayStation 2 and Xbox original only had bare-bones online gaming. But the handful of online DC games were dope. Anyone out there playing Quake 3 Arena nowadays? Well, Sega themselves had a handful of online games, and Outrigger was one of them. A fast-paced first and third-person shooter with absolutely no story. Seriously, there's literally nothing. It's just, there's dudes with guns, and the world, it doesn't matter. What is the training courses for? The International Counterterrorism Special Force. That's all you get, baby. Log online and shoot guys. That is, if you could figure out how to control the dang thing. There's like 20 different control schemes, and all of them are totally crisscrossed and not great. I found one that was acceptable, but the Dreamcast controller really shows off how much it sucks with something like this. Don't you just miss holding a controller that was guaranteed to give you cramps and early onset carpal tunnel? There's a lot of old SegaNet games out there that have newer private servers due to someone out there still caring about video game preservation, but unfortunately, Outrigger is not one of them. It's a pretty decent split-screen game, but the online is definitely what makes it. Maybe one day there will be a private server, but that is not this day.
So now y'all know the type of game I'm talking about, not some grand and cool JRPG adventure, but instead something more like Floyd Bros. Episode 1, coming out several months after the Dreamcast was discontinued.
I don't know why they thought putting episode 1 on the cover was a good idea, but here we are. This is Floyd Bros., a game made by Visual Concepts, so you might know as the people who worked on Toe Jam and Earl 3, Nickelodeon Guts, and recently the newest WWE game. That kinda says most of it, huh?
Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
I was waiting for you to say it, man.
Floyd Bros. Is one of the strangest video games I've seen in a while. Okay, it's like what would happen if you combined Lemmings and a platformer. You control the smaller brother, Hoigel, and you essentially are babysitting the larger one, Moigel. You can play games with him in order to like get points, which are used as a currency between them to bribe each other to do things. It's so absurd. I feel like someone took a good look at the year 2001 and thought to themselves, you know what would take the world by storm? Something successful enough to get an episode 2? A video game that feels like a cartoon from the 40s and 50s. I mean, they even enlisted Jason Marsden and famous character actor Frank Weller to play the brothers. Yeah, freaking Scooby-Doo and Megatron is this big doofus.
What's a 6-letter word that means genius?
Michael.
Oh, yeah, good.
Floyd Bros. Was leaning into this very specific aesthetic, I guess, but then you boot up the game and you're done in 2 hours. Heck, maybe less. This is one of the shortest full-priced games I've played on this channel. There's no replay value either. It's just a weird puzzle game with terrible controls, hard to understand puzzles, and the most annoying boss fights ever. Yeah, make sure you throw the bomb at the cat 9 times, because 9 lives, haha. Floyd Bros. Was a really decent concept, but it's kinda doomed from the get-go based on its, well, everything really. I also feel like it doesn't really know what it wants to be sometimes, because suddenly you're carrying a dire-looking skeleton key in the middle of a slapstick, haha, cartoony domestic violence nightmare. Apparently, this was gonna be an early Dreamcast game, but it got delayed into oblivion past the point of no return. But there is a funny quote where the president at the time, Bernie Stellar, allegedly said that Floyd will do for Sega what Mario did for Nintendo. I guess so. But hey, this barely 2-hour-long, glitchy, and weird, not very good game got an 8.4 from IGN, so truly, anything is possible.
Yeah, Floyd Bros. Is one of those forgotten games, but for a good reason. But imagine for a second, if you would, the future where we're playing Floyd Bros. 26 on the Dreamcast 4. Kind of want that. Anyways, next we're going to be moving into the glamorous world of licensed video games, and as luck would have it, the Dreamcast has a lot of exclusive ones, so why not keep it retro and talk about wacky races?
I don't know who decided that we needed a wacky races video game in the year 2000, but I don't hate it. Hanna-Barbera Saturday morning cartoon, clearly based off the 60s film The Great Race, was a ridiculous concept in general, but it was the zany characters that really took it over the top. I mean, it's literally about a bunch of people racing in order to become the, quote, world's wackiest racer, and if you ever find yourself competing to become the world's wackiest anything, well then, Godspeed. Who could forget Penelope Pitstop, the Slag Brothers, or of course, Dick Dastardly and his cackling dog Muttley. And well, the cursed Infogrames would make a game out of it. 2 if you include the Game Boy. The Dreamcast one was made by Appaloosa Interactive, who did Echo the Dolphin as well as Garfield Caught in the Act, both games we've talked about before, and that bodes well, I know, but I actually kinda dig it. Technically, this did come out on the PlayStation 1 and was re-enhanced for the Dreamcast and PS2, but I didn't know that until writing this script, and I already recorded all the footage, so here we go. Right out of the gate, you're tossed into an overworld that's kinda like Diddy Kong Racing, and I'm immediately down. There was something about driving around that massive WizPig statue that was extremely nostalgic, and this invokes that. Unfortunately, the racing isn't quite as tight as that, but it works well enough. Overall, it's your standard kart racing affair. You boost, drift, and use random items on your way to victory, but with a zany cartoon aesthetic that is unmistakably, well, wacky. The game itself looks very true to the source material, and it kind of looks like Cell Damage a bit. Rather than picking up power-ups, you pick up coins that will give you charges for your special abilities, so you get to pick and choose. It's not Sonic Racing transformed, obviously, but it certainly beats the hell out of Nick Kart.
I don't want to be around anymore.
Next up, we got Max Steel. Anyone know Max Steel?
Mission accomplished.
I wouldn't be surprised if you don't. Max Steel is a multimedia toy franchise made by Mattel, a company who's done a bunch of these before. Masters of the Universe and Mighty Max immediately come to mind. Oh, and Barbie. But in 1999, they tried this with Mr. Max Steel, a big, strong dude who was, I guess, secret agent G.I. Joe man. In 99, I was drinking coffee and short trading stocks, so this wasn't quite in my demographic, but I was a subscriber to the official Dreamcast magazine, and this thing was dope. I miss the old days of demo discs. You'd get one of these things once a month, and as a kid who couldn't afford everything, you'd play certain games and demos over and over. Max Steel Covert Missions was one of those. I had this one demo disc that actually had Max and Outrigger on it, but this is primarily how I experienced Max. I wouldn't know who he was without it. But now, as an adult playing the full game, it's pretty mid. In fact, I would say disappointing, specifically because it was developed by Treyarch. Yeah, Spider-Man 2 and Tony Hawk port Treyarch. Visually, this game looks pretty solid for the time, but the gameplay just isn't up to par. It follows the most generic toy cartoon plot that you can think of, where Max is fighting the evil forces, but it's not memorable at all. It feels like a game that was made to sell more toys or vice versa, which is probably true, but it also feels like it should have been a first-person shooter on the PC. Instead, it's a lot of janky punching, kicking, and shooting dudes until they die. You can, of course, activate max strength or max stealth, but there's no massive, bulging, glowing biceps here. Imagine Star Wars Shadows of the Empire without the charm and somehow less precise controls than the Nintendo 64 controller. And then you got Max Steel. Next.
One more licensed game in? Why not a good one? Now, I bought this when it was cheap originally, and that's not really gonna happen anymore since the retro gaming market decided it's gonna suck for the rest of time, but we're gonna be talking about this. I don't ever see it getting a port. I don't really see it being mentioned anywhere, really, but did you know that there's a Dreamcast version of Record of Lotus War?
I wouldn't be surprised if you didn't know Record of Lotus War. It was originally a series of what's known as Dungeons & Dragons replays, which are transcribed serialized D&D sessions as a readable thing. The game setting, of course, being Sword World RPG instead of D&D. But it's not that far away from a D&D audio drama such as The Unexpectables or Critical Role. The main difference being that Lotus War is from the 80s, way older than what you see today. Well, these serialized sessions were then popular enough to become light novels and an absolutely gorgeous OVA in 1990 and a pretty cool anime in 98, completely unrelated to the Record of Agarest War game with the titty mouse pad. Well, in 2000 and 2001 in the States, we'd get Record of Lotus War, Advent of Cardis, and for once, the worst box art isn't the American one. What's going on in Europe, huh? Lotus was never very popular outside of Japan, and I wouldn't be surprised if this game sold around 20k tops in the States. It's developed by Neverland, who made Rune Factory and two of my favorite Super Nintendo RPGs, Lufia 1 and 2. So I was pretty interested to see what this was. Not really sure why Crave decided to publish it, but I thank them. Lotus War is like Diablo, like a really early console Diablo-style dungeon crawler. It kind of falls somewhere between Ys and Baldur's Gate on how it feels, though not as smooth as either of those. You have loot dropping pretty regularly and even an inventory to manage. You start off as a nameless warrior being resurrected by the wizard Wart in order to defeat the goddess of destruction, Cardis. I'm sure the first thing that you'll notice is that everything is really dark. Not sure if it was my cables, but it's what I got. The game itself is pretty cool though. You meet up with characters from the show like Parn and Deedlit, who sure like to yell out the names of their attacks over and over. But you'll be schmooving around and fighting hordes of demons, goblins, dudes, and whatever the heck the game throws at you. It's pretty tough and requires a lot of grinding. In fact, the instruction booklet's like, if you aren't one-shotting guys, you gotta get stronger, which you do by crafting. There weren't many action RPGs on the Dreamcast, but Lotus War is a pretty good one. Plus, what other game lets you own an entire fortress of goblins who serve your every command? Besides Goblin Commander. It's certainly no Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance, but that's kind of an unfair comparison. The Diablo games on console were dope, but they're not 3D. Lotus War is kind of ahead of its time, and the scale of what it was trying to do is pretty cool. Unfortunately, I didn't get as far into it as I would have liked, but it's a pretty thick game, all things considered. It's definitely worth a look, especially if you're a fan of the anime and novels, just maybe not that price.
I think that if we were to take a look at Dreamcast imports, then this entire category gets blown open, especially for a Western market. There's literally hundreds of games that didn't leave Japan. So why don't we look at a few of them?
First off, the fact that North America didn't get the original release of Rez is a crime and should be treated as such. Second off, the fact that I have to look at Sega Gaga without a clue of what's going on makes me want to risk getting jump scared by the Duolingo bird. Sega Gaga was a video game taking place in 2025, so 3 years from now, in a world where Sega only owns like 3% of market share of video games. So they literally made a weird RPG about Sega being in dire straits and released it 2 days before publicly discontinuing the Dreamcast in reality, and it's brilliant. But I guess that makes sense when you can sit and make a game on the console, push it to store shelves, and have it only sell 500 copies, allegedly. The Lost Golem was a small-scale puzzle game that came out in early 2000 where you have to guide a small king to the exit of each stage. It's an indie and it's not bad at all for what it is, but 500 copies is very unfortunate. The list of imports goes on and on. Sakura Wars Online, or Sakura Wars in general, the Neon Genesis Evangelion Rei Ayanami project, Digi-Chariot. You could fill an entire closet with the amount of visual novels and dating sims that didn't get localized outside of Japan, but there's only a tiny shelf for something like Zusar Vasar. Yeah, I also have no idea what's going on. Zusar Vasar, I think I'm saying that right, is a racing game where you pick a combination of mecha animals and a chariot. It's one of those things where you've never heard of it, but you always knew in the back of your head that something like this existed. Weirdly, I feel like this is really similar to that original Xbox game, Circus Maximus Chariot Wars, but with less mechanics. I can't think of many racing games where you use your lower half as a weapon, but here we are. Also, it's not very good, so yeah, Sega Gaga win.
The Dreamcast was mostly fueled by Japanese developer support, and I don't think there's another company that was more prominent on the console than Capcom. You might even call it their golden age.
Capcom and the Sega Dreamcast were a match made in heaven. You might as well just toss the whole PlayStation 1 and 6th gen of consoles in there too. They were just popping out bangers left and right with tons of really cool characters. Everyone knows Street Fighter, and to be fair, they were good-ass Street Fighters at the time, but there's also games like Dino Crisis, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Power Stone 1 and 2, and countless others that stood above the crowd. There was a whole Japanese exclusive series of RPGs called El Dorado Gate that got 7 individual volumes on the Dreamcast alone, and yes, that's Yoshitaka Amano on art, the GOAT.
I've talked in the past about Techromancer and how cool it is, but there's one more fighting game on the console that deserves words, and it's Project Justice. I love this game.
You'd have to try really hard to go wrong with Capcom and fighters at this time, and Project Justice, the follow-up to Rival Schools, keeps that lineage going. Also, this thing is crazy expensive these days, and I got my copy for like $30 ages ago. All the Capcom titles on Dreamcast are so pricey now, and this probably isn't gonna help that, but look, Project Justice freaking rules. Each of the characters is a member of a different school, and they're usually represented as a club member or president. This is a sequel to the PlayStation 1 Rival Schools, so it's got a lot of carryover, but also a handful of new mechanics and characters. For example, Zaki. She's no Tiffany, but she's good. Everyone is so over the top, and a lot of the combat has that quick Capcom feel without being overwhelming. I mean, look, I got Swimmer Man here doing like cartwheels on people. What's there not to love? Anything with parrying is good to me, or as it's called here, tardy counters. There's not much to say on a fighter here besides like game good, do recommend, but well, Capcom did a whoopsie. For some reason, just like the first game, an entire extra game mode was omitted from English release. Completely axed, and it's not small. There's a single player board game mode that includes character creation. Rival Schools had a dating sim thing, and Project Justice had you playing something similar where you would increase your stats and change the way you looked by moving around the map and engaging in fights randomly along the way. This was apparently dropped in localization because of the sheer amount of time it would take to do so. Initially I was like, why? But then I realized Justice launched in the States in May of 2001, months after the console was announced as dead, so it's like, did they really want to allocate that many resources to a game that's already niche on a console that's on its last legs with only a Sonic Adventure 2 left? Yeah, probably not. Play this emulated. Don't even look at those prices. It's stupid. Or, you know, Capcom could be super cool and make another fighting collection with like this, Techromancer, Power Stone, and well, I don't think that one's gonna happen, but we can dream. Well, now I was gonna talk about Mach-N X at length, but this game is like way too cool. Atlas Wind made themselves a first-person sword combat game that reeks of Shin Megami Tensei in the aesthetic, the music, the art, the monsters you fight. This thing is awesome, and I want to talk about it more another time, probably in a Forgotten Atlas Games video, but I will show you this.
Not too bad for an artificial brain.
Say it like you mean it.
Just so you know, the most popular ROM is an undub, but I love that English.
There's one last game I want to talk about today, and it's one I actually have a story for. So, around Christmas time as a kid, I would try to sneak around looking for presents, as I'm sure a couple of you have, and there was one year where I managed to find a Dreamcast kind of tucked away in the closet along with a couple of games, one being Elemental Gimmick Gear, or Egg, as you can see. Now, I was so happy that I found this game and this console, then I decided to, for some reason, taunt my parents about the fact that I knew, so I was like, hey, are we gonna have any eggs for breakfast? How about lunch? I would really like some eggs, and I would never ask for eggs, by the way. And my mom picked up on that, so she's like, hey, are you in trouble? Did you sneak around? And of course, I cry in feign ignorance, and I managed to convince my parents that it was some kind of crazy coincidence, but oh, I knew. I was a little bastard, and this is Elemental Gimmick Gear.
This game is way too complicated for a kid, or at least it was for me. Elemental Gimmick Gear is an extremely strange game made by Birthday, a developer you definitely haven't heard of who made a handful of JRPGs throughout the years, but have never had a single one leave Japan. That is until Egg. Published by Hudson and Vatical Entertainment here in the States, this was a launch window game for the Dreamcast, coming out literally on December 31st of 1999. Who's going out to buy video games on the literal eve of Y2K? Well, considering I've never seen anyone mention this game, probably no one. Which is a shame because it's incredibly cool. Originally planned to be a Sega Saturn release, Egg is this relatively complicated story about the effects of future technology hitting an underdeveloped society. You play as an unnamed guy who's given the name Leon by default, who is then revealed to be someone called Beta, who's inside the egg-shaped mechs, who's then given a mission to stop a cataclysmic event called the breeding. So Beta must stop the breeding. The joke involuntarily writes itself. You do this by diving deep into the massive ruin called Fogna, and what can only be seen as a Zelda clone, but a pretty solid one. The gimmick here is that you're piloting the egg robot. It's pretty cool actually. You'll talk to NPCs who will be like, wow, what an outdated model you have, since they ran with your unit as the base for their expanding technology. So there's puzzles, enemies to fight, upgrades to unlock, and lots of spinning to be done. Your health also acts as your fuel, so unless you upgrade it, your your spin attack also drains your HP. It's a neat little mechanic. It's also objectively better than punching dudes, which has a bit of a wonky hitbox. In order to win, you gotta spin. You unlock spells and other little gadgets, and it just has this really cool vibe to it that a lot of games miss. The other main gimmick is that anytime you get into boss combat, the game completely flicks over to 3D. Similar controls and everything, but it's like when you'd be playing an old Final Fantasy and it'd swap over to the pre-rendered cutscenes for an important moment. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like a lot of reviewers were too keen on this at the time, with the reception being very mixed. Although I do think that this is a sign of the times, what with games that were 2D or anything seen as a step back being bad. But for me, Egg is like a perfect throwback to the 2D action RPGs you'd see on the Saturn or the PlayStation 1, like Alundra or Dark Savior. Granted, it's not as good as some of them because it does feel a bit convoluted by comparison. You're gonna get lost, you're gonna die, and you're definitely gonna struggle to understand what's going on. The art team produced some really awesome pieces and some unique looking characters, but they don't pop out well in game. The world itself does though, as the isometric world stands out a lot. You might just have an issue understanding how to navigate because there's no map. Also, the US box art looks like they saw this original piece and didn't know how to replicate it, so they just made Beta look like he was holding in a fart. I like Elemental Gimmick gear. It's not for everyone, it's definitely the game with the most barriers to entry in this video, but it's also the one that captivated me as a kid. Well, at least until I got Evolution, a game that dumb children like myself could understand, and I totally forgot about it. What, you think I was smart enough to figure out puzzles like this at 9? You think I knew cardinal directions? Get real.
And there you have it, a sampling of some of what I think are a bunch of forgotten Dreamcast games. There's obviously hundreds of these, and if you have one that you would like me to maybe take a look at in the future, please leave me a comment down in the comments, I guess. I'm always looking for stuff. There, I didn't really know about Floyd Brothers until recently, and that's unfortunate. Anyways, I've been Austin, and catch me next time when I actually talk about Babylon's Fall, because I needed to delay it, and you're gonna see why.
Thank y'all so much for watching. Special Patreon shout out to Blackfoot Ferret, Chris Shelton, Christopher Olivia, Doug Prince, DX Buster, David Molnar, Elijah, GM Pinks, Hey Quiggles, Jay Roos, Jacoby Fitzpatrick, Kevin Zanowski, Karen Arter, Nick Irving, P-Funk, Randall Bentley, Ryan Talbert, and Shazan. Thank you all so much for the very generous support. This took a bit longer to come out, but that's because I decided to push a Babylon's Fall video back very slightly, and oh, am I so glad that I did. If you've only been keeping up with the news. Anyway, that'll be coming y'all's way real soon, and I'll see you guys next week, week after, sometime soon. Look, I'm making stuff. Support the Patreon, buy the t-shirts. I might have some new stuff coming soon for that, and I'll see you soon.